If you saw a ghost, would you call 911? These people did. Let's get into 4 super creepy times the police and the paranormal met. See if you're brave enough to make it all the way to number 1. Number 4, the man who was not what he seemed. One evening, about 8 years ago, it was raining heavily outside when we got a call from an elderly woman. She said that she could hear footsteps in her house and thought there might be a ghost because she regularly heard the sound of someone walking upstairs, although she lived alone. We went to the house to investigate and make sure everything was okay. She stayed on the line with 911 because she was petrified. About 3 minutes after her initial call, she told the operator that there was a man in her backyard, staring at her through her sliding glass door. The woman was so scared that she couldn't move and just stared at the man for a couple of minutes. She said he never moved during that time, just stood there staring back at her. Eventually, he ran away. When we got there, 12 minutes later, the other officer went to check the backyard in case he was still hiding or left some trace evidence behind. I stayed with the woman in the foyer. I spoke with her for several minutes until the other officer returned. He said that there was no trace of anyone having been in the backyard. We set off to do a quick sweep before we left to make sure the house was all clear. We found a trail of mud and footprints in the living room by the sliding glass door. Eventually, the prints faded away from the stairs leading to the second level. I asked the woman if she had been outside or if anyone had come over. She said no, and that she lived alone. Here's the creepy part. The woman was very old, probably around 85, and had very poor eyesight and was hard of hearing, as elderly people tend to be. It soon became obvious to me that she had seen a man's reflection in her sliding glass door and mistakenly thought he was in front of her on the other side of the glass in her backyard. In reality, he had been standing only a few feet behind her in the same room while she had been talking to 911. Once I realized this, I immediately drew my gun and told the other officers there may be an intruder in the house. We searched the house, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a very strange grunting sound. There, in the woman's bedroom, was a man doing push-ups. I asked the man what he was doing, and he just said, "I'm doing what my master told me to do." We arrested him for breaking and entering. I can't say who it is, but after several years in a mental hospital, that man eventually went on to start a very famous conspiracy webpage and streaming video service. Well, that's upsetting. I hope that man got the help he needed. Now for a story much harder to explain. Number 3, the Green River Haunting. There's an area in the Pacific Northwest of the United States that's famous for all the wrong reasons. The Green River in Washington State is notorious for the gruesome serial killer that got named after the river. I was a rookie police officer in the early 2000s, a few years after that man had already been arrested, so I didn't deal with him directly. But I was familiar with some of the areas he spent time in and where some of the victims were found. Even though he was caught, the area just had this dark cloud hanging over it, you know? It didn't help that it felt like it never stopped raining during the winter. So one night we get this call from a local farmhouse. They claim their neighbor's house, which had been abandoned for over a decade, had some sort of activity going on. Mind you, this is like 2 a.m, and yes, it's pouring down rain. Being the rookie cop, I, of course, was working the night shift and I got the call to go check it out. All of the houses in that area were situated on large acre parcels, so even though this one house called it in, they weren't really that close to the house in question. Oh, and in case you haven't already guessed, this house sat on the banks of the Green River. So I drive my patrol car down the long driveway, and I'm about halfway down. I can see some debris covering the gravel driveway. I put the car in park and I get out to move it. The house was within view at this point, but still maybe 50 meters away. As I was pulling this large branch off the driveway, I hear a blood-curdling scream coming from the direction of the house. I jerk up and I look toward the house. "Hello?" I shout as I pull out my gun and flashlight. Silence. I waited a few moments, but still nothing. I needed to get up to the house, so I finished clearing the driveway and jumped back in my patrol car. Obviously on edge, I sat there a moment debating if being a police officer was really for me. Finally, I summoned the courage and I put the car in drive, slowly approaching the house. I put the high beams and flashers on just in an attempt to let anyone in the house who might be in there know that I was approaching. I opened the front door of my patrol car and I reached for my loudspeaker, calling for anyone in the pitch black house to come out. Nothing. Silence. Just silence and rain. At this point, I'm starting to question whether or not I really heard that scream. Maybe it was a nearby wild animal or something. So I approach the front door, my hand on my gun but still in the holster, and knock on the front door. Still nothing. I try the doorknob, and it's locked. At this point, I'm fairly confident there's no one there. I mean, I had to clear the driveway, so no one would have been able to drive up there recently, and there was no signs of activity. So I'm standing at the front door, my patrol car headlights illuminating me from behind, and I'm reaching for my walkie on my chest to report no activity when, I kid you not, something moved between me and the headlights. A huge shadow washed across the front of the house and me. I spun around, drew my gun, and found myself staring into the headlights, unable to see anything. I quickly moved to the side so I could see who was there, but I couldn't find anyone. Now covered in goosebumps, I wasn't sure what to do. I could explain away the scream in the distance as maybe belonging to an animal, but I don't think a wild animal would be willing to walk right in front of my patrol car headlights when I wasn't looking. And it's not like I was being quiet. It just didn't make sense. At that point, I was confident someone was watching me from the dark. And that's when it happened. The front door suddenly squeaked open, almost like I was being invited to come inside. Call me a chicken, call me whatever you want, but I know there are forces in this world that can't be explained. I immediately jumped in my patrol car and called for backup. We were in a pretty rural area, so it took about 10 minutes for the two other officers working that night to show up. By this time, the rain had let up, and I had a pretty hard time explaining why I called for backup. We all checked out the house together and found nothing. It took me years to live down that moment, but I know what I heard, saw, and felt that night. About a decade later, that house was put on the market, but apparently couldn't find a buyer. It turns out there were 3 victims of the Green River Killer met their end in that house. Last I heard, some investment firm bought the property, bulldozed the house, and is just waiting for the right developer to come along. It really is quite a beautiful spot, if not for the gruesome history and constant rain in the winter. I would highly encourage you to just let that story be and not do any additional research on the Green River or its killer. This officer's account of that night is upsetting enough, in my opinion. What you should do, however, is definitely subscribe and turn on notifications for my channel. You don't want to miss out on any of the videos. On to the next video. See if you become a true believer by the time I finish number 1. I bet you will be. Number 2, The Unwanted Visitor. An elderly woman in her mid-60s contacted me, claiming that she had been dealing with nightly ghost sightings in either her basement or attic for approximately a week. Upon entering the home and investigating both the downstairs and upstairs areas, I didn't detect any unusual activity. I shone my flashlight in the attic, but I saw nothing. The basement had lights on and there was nothing to be seen. A week went by and I got called back to her house again, this time for a night shift. I checked the basement first. Nothing. I was checking the attic when I found a man in torn and ragged clothes crouched in the corner. Apparently, he had been climbing into her window on cold nights. Although there were no ghosts present, it still freaked me out to see somebody lurking around like that. We ended up arresting him but dropped the charges because what he needed most was help rather than a criminal record. He was homeless, so we helped him find a shelter to stay at for future needs. Since then, I haven't seen him again. It's my job to protect and serve people as best I can, so I tried to take this situation to heart and do just that, help both the resident and the trespasser equally without judgment. Do you think the police officer made the right decision? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Number 1, the skeptic sheriff becomes a believer. My uncle was the sheriff of a small town in New Mexico. He was always very serious-minded and never really joked around, so when he told the story that my aunts backed up, we all believed it without a question. Michael D., a local reporter, would always show up at any major police activity he heard about from his police scanner, car wrecks, fires, anything that might be worth reporting in the local paper. Everybody on the force knew Michael because he was around all the time, Michael was always playing tricks on people and liked to flick them behind their ears. People would turn around thinking there was a bug, only to see it was Michael joking around. He was always making people laugh, and honestly, everybody loved him. Tragically, Michael died suddenly from lung cancer. His wife buried him against his wishes. He wanted to be cremated. For the next few weeks after his funeral, people kept claiming to see Michael at car wrecks and fires, the same sort of events he used to report on. There were 20 to 30 reports like this from civilians and police officers alike. My uncle was skeptical at first, but then he and my aunt showed up to our house one night with guns drawn. They looked terrified. We asked them what happened, and he had to sit down before telling us the story. Just a reminder, this is a guy that I never saw get rattled by anything. He said that he and my aunt were sitting on the couch watching TV when my uncle started scratching his ear repetitively. Eventually, my aunt asked him what was wrong. Right as she did, Michael D. walked into their room from the doorway, clear as day, according to my uncle. My uncle then stood up, shouted some profanities, and got my aunt's attention, who looked over to see Michael too. The moment they both locked eyes with him, Michael grinned, spun around, and sauntered out their front door. He shut the door firmly behind him and vanished. My uncle managed to calm himself down and ran outside with his gun looking for Michael. But by the time he got there, Michael was gone. So they came over to our place instead. We didn't see anything when we went back over there, but my aunt and uncle stayed at our place that night. At work the next day, all the guys in the force were giving my uncle lots of "we told you so" jabs. People continued to see Michael at crime scenes around town for a few more months. My dad even saw him in our dark basement room flicking his friends' ears. Toward the end of the third month, those who saw him said he looked progressively worse. My uncle saw him 2 more times, each time confirming that he was looking more and more worn down. My dad concluded that he was decomposing and his ghost was reflecting that process. Now every time my ear itches, I get goosebumps. Wow, it sounds like there was no doubting the existence of ghosts in that small town. How would you feel if something like that happened to you? What creepy video do you want to watch next?